So, well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to give a little bit of an overview on esports. I'm also sharing my screen right now for a little presentation that I'm going to take us through. I just want to make sure, is everyone able to see? I think I have it on share screen. Does everyone see a presentation that's popped up here? Okay, great, perfect. Got to make sure the Zoom tech stuff is covered. Okay, well, wonderful. So essentially, what I'm going to do, I have 30 minutes, and I'm going to try to go through as much as I can about what esports are, sort of why they've started to become popular recently, and where basically this is going. Unfortunately, this is a massive topic, so I probably won't get through everything I have to share, but I'll try to manage time as best I can, keeping an eye on my phone here. And then, as we get to natural resting points, we can do so. But also, please feel free to interrupt me with questions. The value of seeing this versus, say, watching a lecture that I've given previously or something is you can actually interact with me. So, like, please interact with me. I'm happy to be here because I am live. I will also say just a little bit about my background. So I went to Amherst College, Harvard Business School. I worked for a while in sort of traditional industries like BCG and ISL. Then I joined Hasbro, which is what brought me to Rhode Island. I actually had the great pleasure of working with Carlos. He is a fantastic guy. I loved my time at Hasbro, but did end up leaving to actually start businesses in esports. And in particular, I founded a couple businesses. Gamer Sensei, which raised about 6 million in venture capital. It's a popular coaching platform that's still around. Also Genji, Oxygen, and some of the Helix centers that have been touched on. I also teach esports at Becker College in Massachusetts, where I have an honorary professorship. And I generally try to do sort of thought leadership activities in the space, whether it's the podcast that I have, my writings for the Japan Times, my research in the IGE, and most excitingly, this book. Is it going to let me advance here, guys? Here we go. Yeah, the Book of Esports, which everyone should check out, and which this talk is heavily based on. So again, I wouldn't be a good self-promoter if I didn't say the Book of Esports, available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. So with that out of the way, let's talk about what we're going to try to do today, and the operative word being sort of try, because I don't think we'll get through all of this. So first of all, I'm going to try to give sort of a working definition for what esports are a little bit, TBD. I'm going to try to discuss a little bit how big esports have gotten. Then we're going to try to talk about why esports are getting so big right now. And I think this is really important because you sort of, to understand what's happening in esports, you need to understand why esports is happening now. And so we'll go through that. And then hopefully, if we have time, we'll talk about why esports are like ketchup, but hopefully not like mustard. And that's my absolute favorite topic. So if we get to it, that's actually, I think, the most important challenge facing esports today, the ketchup or mustard question. And we'll dive into that. So let's get started with what I consider to be sort of a working definition of esports. And basically, I hate all the definitions of esports that have ever been given. But the definition that I sort of tend to come with are esports are competitive skill-based games that are played in teams or alone, in tournaments, right? And not all video games are esports, because esports specifically require elements like strategy, teamwork, and precision reflexes. They are extremely skill intensive. And this type of definition is relatively broadly inclusive, but I think it's fair to be broadly inclusive with esports. For example, I think perhaps if the original Doom came out today with other market factors and things that are present, Doom would be an esport today, right? So I think this is fair. And I think even games like chess, technically, if they'd evolved in a different way, might qualify as esports. Certainly, you see top chess players now being signed to esports pro teams, if anyone's been checking out the news. So I think a broadly inclusive definition is important. I think the big thing, though, that's missing here in this definition I offer, and sort of what helps to cut through the clutter of, well, all games have skill and everything, is the intent behind the sport. Because more and more, I believe that what really separates esports from other video games is that they are designed to be watched. They are not designed solely as a spectator experience. They are also designed as a viewership experience. And in fact, viewership and the monetization structures that come from viewership are inherent to the success of the underlying game itself. Now, we won't have a lot of time to dig that in, but I would say if you don't like the working definition I propose here, just add on the plus designed with intent for viewership, and you usually get to a place that you like, I find, as you analyze the industry. So how big are esports? Like, do they even matter? Like, why are we having a conference on them, right? So this is one of my all-time favorite graphs for esports. This is comparative viewership as of 2016. 2016. I'm going to stress that to you guys right now. And this is from Goldman Sachs. That's why I like this graph, because everyone says, oh, Goldman Sachs, it must be right. This is their esports report. I think it was actually done by my buddy, Whitney Baxter. And it ranks comparative viewership. And what you see here is that even in 2016, esports events like the League of Legends World Championships or an ESL1 for Counter-Strike Global Offensive were outperforming events like the NBA Finals or even the World Series of Baseball. And in fact, this graph was so popular because in 2016, behind this, we actually have the LCS finals. You can't really probably see this in the screen, but the image behind this is the LCS finals from the Staples Center. And that was really a wake-up moment for esports when people just realized how many people were watching, because you were able to fill out a major sporting arena like this. So this was 2016. So like, how big are things today? Well, let's check it out. So flash forward 3 years later to today, and we're now beating the Super Bowl for viewership. As you can see, the League of Legends Championship Series has exceeded 100 million viewers, up from 30. I mean, that is just insane, up from 32 million viewers. So this sport is arguably more popular than the Super Bowl. Actually, I gave a TED talk on esports recently, and I had to caveat this by saying more popular than some Super Bowls, because I guess there's variability in the viewership. And in terms of market size, you know, I just co-authored this paper that estimates the size of the industry at $25 billion. Now, that is an all-in figure, including streamer earnings, pro teams, publisher revenues from esports associated titles, etc. But I particularly like this number as a true industry size, and I stand by it. I think it's very accurate. There is a number you might commonly see cited for esports. It's a Newzoo number that's more around $1 billion. I don't like that number because if you actually look at what Newzoo puts in it, it's literally just the events budget. So it's basically an esports events market size, not a true esports industry market size. And I feel very strongly that if a player is spending $1 on, say, a digital item in League of Legends to be more competitive, that should count towards the esports market size opportunity. So the bottom line is humongous market. And where do people watch all this? So where do you watch esports? Because this is sort of a common question. So I said it's viewership driven. I said it's big. I said a lot of people are watching. Where are they watching? They're watching on these streaming platforms, places like Twitch, which was owned by Amazon. They bought that for $1 billion. It's arguably the best investment Amazon has ever made, and that's saying something. And these are live streaming platforms. If you're not familiar, you should check it out. I won't spend too much time here, but essentially you click in, you can choose from thousands of streams, and you can watch your favorite streamer play. And they are both playing the game and talking live and interacting with the chat. So it's a very social and community-driven experience. And it's not just Amazon in the space. YouTube has properties here. Facebook has properties here. Microsoft had properties here until recently. Most scarily, Tencent and a number of large Chinese companies own properties, which will probably be hugely disruptive to the US market because of Tencent's broad power from investment. So I believe there's a lot of change coming to this space going forward, but we won't have too much time to talk about that today. But this is where people watch. So with that up front out of the way, as I check my time, now I ask my favorite question. So like, why now, right? Like, why is all of this happening now? Because we've had video games for like forever. So like, why didn't this happen like 10 years ago? Why didn't it happen 20 years ago even, right? And so that's the first question I want to set out to answer to give you guys some perspective. So if you go back to the dawn of time, this is basically what the first video game looks like. It's Birdie the Brain, and it is a series of light bulbs that play tic-tac-toe, right? That's basically, you can argue where video games really started. I like this as a starting point for video games, Birdie the Brain. Okay, this is where we began. Then, you know, 10, 20 years later, we got to arcades and we had games like the classic Donkey Kong, where you see here, Mario's climbing up ladders and jumping and defeating, you know, this by jumping on Donkey Kong's head. And then even a little bit later, Mario came home to the, you know, Nintendo Entertainment System. And now he's running around on not just a single screen, but multiple screens. There's different levels. Mario can do a lot more than run and jump. He can get big. He can shoot fireballs. But what's essentially happening here, I would argue, is that games are inventing the first S in what I think is the SCAR framework, which is one of the ways you can explain the rise of esports, and it's skill, plain and simple. Because if you think of tic-tac-toe, it's like, it does not require a lot of skill, let's be honest. Like, and it's not a deep game. You're not going to sit for dozens of hours playing tic-tac-toe. When you go to the arcade, you get a little bit better, but arguably it's not a pursuit people want to devote their lives to, although the King of Kong documentary may disagree with me, but I think that's very niche. But once you start to get to Mario, you start to really see more persistent experience that has evolution. And if you take this forward to today with a game like League of Legends, I mean, wow, right? Like you have people, this can stand up to tens of thousands of hours of play by top tier players and still see new emergent strategies and trends. So you have the first growth factor you have driving the rise of esports is just games have taken more skill. That's the first piece driving this trend. But there's another thing that's happening, because if we go back to the Birdie the Brain era, this is what early computers look like. And, they're big, right? Like, they take up entire rooms. And arcades get better. Now, instead of an entire room, you just have to go to a specific room to play. But then eventually, and video games started to come to the home with things like the Nintendo Entertainment System. And so if you follow this evolution, what I really argue is happening here is that games are becoming more accessible, right? That over time, the cost to play games is coming down, and the ability for games to be ubiquitous, to be present, to be accessible to everyone has really gone up. And accessibility, if you take this trend logically forward, where we are now with mobile devices is really sort of the future of things, right? Because now literally everybody is carrying around a gaming computer, literally hundreds of thousands of times more powerful than the original Nintendo in their pocket, right? And I think accessibility is very important as well, because if you think about just like skill, if you're going to devote your time to something, you have to be getting better at it. Otherwise, why are you devoting your time? Accessibility is important because for sports to exist, right, you want a lot of people to be able to play the sport, to be able to discover it and to fall into the skill treadmill. I'll use the example of polo and soccer, right? Like polo may be the world's greatest sport ever. I don't know. I don't own a horse. I've never tried it. I bet most people on this call haven't tried it. But soccer, you just need a ball. It's great. We've all played it, right? Hence, soccer far more popular than polo, right? And so accessibility is another factor driving things here. Now, there's a third factor coming in, which is once you sort of have skill and accessibility, if people don't know, this is a MUD. It's an early text-based adventure game. And this was special. It was played at university campuses on these mainframe computers, these early ones. This is actually a DOS remake of it, but bear with me. It's tough to get original images. But these early MUD games are important because you could actually interact with other players. You could meet somebody else in the mainframe and give them an item or fight them. And so that's pretty cool, right? And then flash forward a little bit later and you have maybe not my favorite console, but one of my favorites, Nintendo 64, where now instead of just interacting somebody and typing give sword, you can actually have meaningful, battles against people at home with a 4-player, multi-tap experience like we have here for Nintendo. And taking that even further forward, you then have games like World of Warcraft, which launched into massive persistent servers with literally tens of thousands of active players, right? And what's really happening here, I would argue, in this trend is the formation of our third factor, community, right? That basically, once you have skill and accessibility around games, people are forming up around games. They're discussing them, they're talking about them, they're engaging in them, they're starting to socialize through them. They're building all the extraneous factors and content that you need to support a sports scene. So just like a soccer game is far bigger than a soccer broadcast, there's all the news around it, there's the draft, there's all the stats optimization if you're into playing DraftKings or something. Community is important for esports in the exact same way. And we have it forming here as the size and scale of the player base builds up. But most importantly is our final factor. And I believe it's really the sudden presence of the fourth factor that makes esports happen right now. So what is this final factor? Well, does anyone know what this is? I wish I could, if I was a teacher, I'd ask questions, but I have to tell you guys, this is the first video game tournament ever. Again, arguably, you can footnote it however you want. But this is a space war tournament taking place at Stanford University. And these guys are playing this. It's actually a pretty cool game where you control a starfighter and you dogfight. And what is the prize for winning this tournament? It's a subscription to Rolling Stone magazine. So it's like $60, right? You're hardly going to retire off of that prize. Flash forward a little bit further forward, and this is the first major, I remember this was the first video game tournament I paid attention to. This was a Quake tournament where the prize was John Carmack, who is the designer of Quake. It was his used car. It was his used Ferrari. It was a nice Ferrari, but it was used. Estimated payout for this tournament about $35,000, $45,000. So we're getting better, Still not great. You're still not gonna, you're still not talking NBA levels. But then we have Twitch and this broadcasting platform. And Twitch is super, super, super important for a ton of reasons, but mainly it provides a new monetization angle to these people who before were basically hoping to get dollars and cents from winning tournaments, because now they can produce followings of people who care about them and watch them. And when you have people who have large followings, they're celebrities, and they start to get income from that stream. And in particular, the Twitch platform offers two great sources of income. One is subscriptions. So your fans can literally pay to subscribe to you for certain emotes in the channel. And the other is sponsorship, right? Here we see Ninja, probably the most prominent pro gamer in the world right now. What is the most prominent thing you see in this picture? His Red Bull headband, because Red Bull sponsors him. And crucially, these subscription and sponsorship revenue streams are much more reliable than the tournament streams. Not only are they potentially far greater, but they're much more reliable because Twitch streamers can plan around the income that's coming in from their subs every month, right? They don't have to bet it all that this year they win the world championships for the game of the choice. And so this reliability, as well as the incremental in size, really increased the reward of being good at games. And it was once we had these four factors that esports really exploded, because now you have games you can get good at. You have games that lots of people can try and get good at. You have a community of people who are excited to play the games, forming around it and driving content creation around it. And then you have a reward for getting good at all of this stuff. These are the ingredients that you need for regular sports. And these are the ingredients for esports as well. And so if you want to know why esports started to get really big recently, it was because we really didn't have the reward factor until recently. And we took a while to form the other factors as well. And if you want to know why, for example, esports started much earlier in South Korea, for example, it was because they got these four SCAR factors much earlier than the rest of the world. And so if you're curious about that, you can read my book for great deep dives. I will also say that there is an entirely different perspective you can take on looking at the formation of esports, and it's more business minded. It's one about money and how publishers make money and how over time they have needed to evolve their business models to earn more and better revenues from games. That is called the BAMS model. That is also covered in the book, but we don't have time to discuss that now in this lecture. But suffice it to say that if the story I've told you is from a player perspective right now and why I might want to become a pro player, there's, I believe, an equally compelling story from the business perspective of why publishers would want to get interested in this as they follow the money in gaming. Okay, so we got through all of that and we have 15 minutes left. Perfect. So we talked about sort of why esports came into being. So let's sort of see, where are we today? Like, what games matter in esports? And broadly, there are a ton in the world we wake up today after the SCAR factors have come into being. We find that just like regular sports, esports has lots of different types of games you can play. There are first-person shooters where you run around and kind of gun people. There are these MOBAs or multiplayer online battle arenas where you control a hero from a 3D isometric perspective. There are card games like Hearthstone, fighting games like Street Fighter. You can see some of the most popular esports broken out here. This is just based on most recent sizing. But, broadly, just like we see sports segment into baseball, football, basketball, cricket, soccer, right? Like, esports segments as well. And so a lot of times people talk about esports as this monolithic thing. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's like talking about sports as a monolithic thing. Like, people aren't really sports fans, they're baseball fans. And it might even drill deeper, right? They might even be like Red Sox fans. But, I do think it's important to realize there's a lot of nuance in this industry, particularly because this nuance is very scary. Because if you look at the game types and everything I've shown to you here, there's a critical thing missing, and that's FORTNITE. Because FORTNITE basically did not exist, and the genre of gaming that it represents didn't really exist until 4 years ago. Essentially, FORTNITE invented, actually its predecessor PUBG invented, and FORTNITE kind of copied or cloned an entirely new genre of gameplay called Battle Royale, which is kind of a first-person shooter, but it's not. It's like you're building things. It's 100-person free-for-all. It's very chaotic. You're exploring an island. It's very... And FORTNITE is arguably the most popular esport in the world, or it was until this Apple copyright lawsuit that's going, or, App Store lawsuit stuff that's going on right now, which has significantly curtailed Fortnite's distribution. But it still remains, I think, the biggest linchpin in the zeitgeist. But this is really scary. I think something like Fortnite is really scary. This brings us to this ketchup or mustard question I told you guys about. My favorite question of all time, because here's the thing, right? Like, if you think that like not just like an entirely new category of esport could just come into being, that freaks me out personally. And it freaks me out because of when I go to the supermarket. Because when I go to the supermarket, I go to the condiment aisle and I look at two things. I look at ketchup and I look at mustard. And you can literally see them, right? They're like in the same opposite sides of the aisle together. And these things are extraordinarily similar, right? We consume ketchup and mustard on identical on identical occasions, right? We have them at barbecues, we put them on burgers and hot dogs, right? Like these are very similar things. But if you look at the ketchup aisle, there is basically just one type of ketchup. Or even if there's a store brand, it's made to taste like this sort of platonic ideal of ketchup, which for our market here in the States is Heinz 57. When we buy ketchup, we know what we want it to taste like, and it's Heinz. And there is very small shadow markets for things like sriracha or maple ketchup, but they're tiny. Like ketchup, we've decided this is what ketchup should taste like. This is what we want. But if you look at mustards, it is a lawless and terrifying world because there are like dozens of types of mustard. There's sweet mustard, honey mustard, Dijon mustard, Grey Poupon mustard. Like we cannot decide what type of mustards we like. And we like different mustards on different occasions. I might have Grey Poupon with a steak. I might have yellow mustard on a hot dog, right? And so these two things, ketchup and mustard, they look very similar, but they have produced two vastly different outcomes in market. And that scares me because sports are catch-ups. What you've seen is that over time, each genre of sport has consolidated around a regional ideal, just like Heinz 57. So for example, baseball, right? Like there's a reason we still have the American and the National Baseball Leagues. It's because there were different rules for baseball, but eventually we agglomerated and said, okay, stick and ball sports in America will be played like this. And the rest of the world went a similar path. And so cricket has dominated, for example, Europe and India, right? But there's general market consensus around their category ideal, their platonic ideal of a sport, right? In each particular category. But gaming might not follow that. Gaming could be a mustard because if we look at the games I've listed here to you in popular, like you have many games in the same genre, League of Legends, Dota, you have 3 FPSs here, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, Rainbow Six, Hearthstone, Magic, right? Like there's a lot, and we don't know, are these genres consolidating over time? Some look like they might not be, some look like they are, right? Because I really personally hope that there is consolidation in this industry. And I believe the trend is that way, but we don't have time to talk about why. But I hope the ketchup or mustard question is answered by ketchup. And that's because the last thing I want to talk to you today, which is the leagueification of esports. Because as esports has become a media property, basically, and his publishers in particular have sought to monetize the game through its media and impressions, these gated leagues have formed up around esports, the basic foundations of sporting. So you have the Overwatch League, which was talked about a lot on this for Overwatch. You have the League of Legends LCS. You have the R6, North American scene. You have Hearthstone Grandmasters, Call of Duty World League. You have all these different leagues that have formed around the sports. And many of these leagues sell franchise slots. So for example, the Overwatch League, the last round of franchise slots went for about $45 million. It's crazy, right? But if esports are mustards, like this doesn't work, because why would you pay all that money for something that might not be around, that might change, where tastes might erode or evolve over time, right? And so and conversely, if you're a player, like why would you devote 10 years of think about regular sports, right? Like you might start playing in elementary school all the way through middle school and high school, a sport like soccer, so that you might have a chance of playing in the MLS in America, right? Because you can trust that something like the MLS or the NFL or the MLB will be there, right? So the stability matters not just from the business perspective, but from the player perspective too. And so certainly the trend in the industry right now is people are pushing for this consolidation. There is a lot of money and a lot of power and weight being thrown into the space to produce these category captain games. And the category captainship model, as I said, it looks like it's working today. it looks like there are going to be 2 or 3 dominant types of every genre of game that are going to hold, and that will be very good for the industry, but it is by no means certain, right? And so if you ask what I spend a lot of my time researching and thinking about today in esports, it is this sort of this ketchup or mustard question, other than my day-to-day businesses, because I think how this settles out is going to be really important for the distribution of value and for the growth of the industry moving forward. And so, I wanted to leave time for questions at the end of this talk. So I actually did a very good job getting through. We got through about 50 slides, like lightning fast. You can tell I've taught a fair bit this stuff.
Amaze balls,
But
William.
yeah, I will say I want to leave it open for questions for people now, to have some interactivity. So I tried to end about 5 minutes early. But the most important thing I would take away is like this silly picture of me is here, because esports are really fun. Like, this is the future, I believe, of how people are going to play most competitive activities. And it's not just kids in their basement, like playing games right now. It is a huge industry. It is massively professionalized. There are real career paths here across billions of dollars, right? And most of all, it is just like a great thing to be involved in. Like, you have a blast. And so, my appeal to all the listeners who are watching this is buy my book, like support my businesses. No, but seriously, it's like get involved in this esports space because it is happening right now. And I really do think it's a watershed moment in history. We'll look back at this when we're older and be like, oh my God, I can't believe I was there when like the first season of the LCS was played. Just like people, at one point were like, oh, I was there for the inaugural pitch of baseball ever, So, keep watching and look for ways to get involved because it's changing a lot right now and it's a big deal. All right, wrap up for questions. Suli, are there anything people want to ask me?
Absolutely, William. Thanks for powering through that. Know if you had taken a bit of extra caffeine this morning, William, but
Yeah. Well, I hope I wasn't too fast. I mean, I wanted to make sure I got through the talking points. So,
yeah.
obviously there's a much better version of this presentation where it's romanced, but at least we told a story, I think, and helped move people through what I think is foundational stuff pretty quickly.
Well, and that I'm glad you mentioned that, William, because we are taking a survey afterwards. For those of you on, please do fill that out because we do want to have William back on. There's so many threads that you started in this conversation that we want to absolutely follow up on if there's interest. So we do have a question. The first question is, for esports pros, how many really specialize in one game? And is that the best way to go pro? As an esports novice, it seems like the ability to generalize in esports would be greater than sports.
Yes and no. I think it comes down to there are certainly skills that are shared, right, across games. The most classic example is aiming in shooters, right? Like the same aiming skills are required in basically any shooting game you play with a mouse. So there is an ability to generalize for sure. But that being said, first of all, the best esports and the most successful esports actually require unique skills that lock in their player base pretty effectively. And this is now jumping to a whole different topic in the book, but like a good example is FORTNITE and the building mechanic required in FORTNITE, because that's not present in other battle royale games. It takes a lot of skill to do. And so it's very unique to the title, and it becomes a lock-in effect that encourages players to just stick with that one title. So that's part of it. But just another part of it is there is game awareness that require, you have to know the meta and how it functions, right? If you're curious about that, I have a TED talk coming out on skill in esports. It'll come out in maybe a month, you can watch, that talks about that. But you have to be aware of the meta, you have to be aware of the idiosyncrasies of the given game. And then, candidly today too, like esports careers are woefully short. One of the problems in the industry, and one of the things that, people like Ritual Motion, Dana are working to address, is just we are not good at career extension in esports. If you think of regular sports, right, like so much time and effort has gone into kinesthesiology and sports science and health and well-being to ensure that athletes like Tom Brady can keep playing like forever, right? But we don't really have that in esports today. And so all those factors mean you generally sort of have to pick a game, or at least a genre of game, and stick with it. And there are, because of the uniqueness of games, I do think the specialization tends to lock in players. But that being said, you see people switching. For example, there is a massive trend right now of Overwatch players quitting Overwatch to join Valorant, because Valorant is becoming a more popular game and people want to leave Overwatch. So it does happen.
Totally, William. Thanks so much for that insight. I've got Dana Paul with a question. Dana, you want to take it?
Yeah. Hey, William. First of all, I do suggest that everybody buy William's book. It's amazing. I don't care if you've been following esports forever or if this is your first time. It's really insightful. But William, you brought up a lot of great points, and I'd love to get your thoughts. I always think of esports as the biggest social media platform out there. I mean, it dwarfs Facebook, Instagram. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Because it really is different from a social media perspective.
Yeah, so this is like a really challenging question to answer because, and this goes to something that I just bluntly don't understand about the industry today. Like I have an opinion, but I'm not sure I understand it, and I'm sure really anybody does. But it goes to the question of these broadcasters in the space, like Twitch. Like, what are they? Because I came to this market with an opinion that they were broadcasters, right? Because that's what they do. They take games and people playing games and they broadcast them. So they're just like TV shows, right? But then recently we had this whole thing happen with Mixer, which was Microsoft dumped literally hundreds of millions of dollars into a streaming platform to compete with Twitch, right? And it's Microsoft. It's not like, rinky dink company A, it's like Microsoft can do this, and they have a rich history in gaming with things like the Xbox, which is everywhere. And they poached all the biggest streamers, not just one or two. They poached like many of the biggest streamers off Twitch in categories. For example, Ninja, who was in this presentation, they poached, right? And so I was of the belief at the time that what was going to happen is we were going to, okay, well, people are going to move, onto Mixer, and Mixer will start to work as a streaming platform. But it did not. Mixer basically utterly failed. Ninja's viewership really didn't port effectively. And as a result, Mixer had to sell to Facebook and Facebook Gaming, and it shut down. Like, you can't watch on Mixer anymore right now. And that leads me to believe, and I've thought about this quite a lot, that actually the streaming companies are social networks, that the behaviors they exhibit are more like the behaviors exhibited by Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Because if you think about that scenario, if a big influencer leaves Twitter, you're like, oh, it's sad they're not on Twitter, but I'm going to keep using Twitter. Like, everybody like is on Twitter just because that, and even if 10 or 20 people left, you'd be like, well, it's still Twitter, right? So I think they tend to perform more as social networks, but the broadcasters don't quite realize or treat them as social networks yet. And so I think one of the big challenges coming in the industry, and one of the things I prophesize, is there is going to be a huge, I'm telling you guys, there's going to be a big war between the streaming companies coming. We are in a little bit of a lull right now, but just look at what's happening in Asia and the international competition that's going to come in. Like, there will be a lot coming in the next decade. And I think the winners of that war will be the businesses that figure out that they're social networks before the other streaming companies. But I should say, this view I have is not common in the industry, and it's not even shared by many of the streaming companies themselves. I had an argument recently with the head of BD at Twitch where I was like, you're a social network. He's like, no, we're not. And there's reasons why you don't want to be a social network, because it means certain things, particularly in today's climate, about regulation. So, we'll see what happens, but I think it's one to watch. It's a very open question.
Thank you, William. Thanks for asking the question, Dana. It's a TBC, just getting started kind of challenge, and there will be some battlegrounds, I am sure.